Well, welcome everyone to the CJS seminar. Today we are hugely fortunate to be joined by guest speakers, Professors William Marotti, Emi Foulk Bushelle, and Kelly Midori McCormick. Professor Marotti joins us from UCLA, where he teaches modern Japanese history. He is the author of the brilliant Money, Trains and Guillotines, Art and Revolution in 1960s Japan, which examines the activities of the radical art performers who called themselves the High Red Center. Professor Marotti edited a special issue with Japan Forum quite recently, and which came out in August, entitled Imagination and the Real. This features richly diverse and fascinating articles on this theme, including those by Professor Bushelle and McCormick, who are here with us today. He is currently working on a new book project, The Art of Revolution, Politics and Aesthetic Dissent in Japan's 1968. So welcome, Professor Marotti. And Professor Bushelle joins us from Western Washington University in the northern reaches of Washington State, where she teaches Japanese history. Her research interest spans from the medieval to the modern, with particular attention to kokugaku, waka poetics, and the history of philology in Japan. She is currently working on a book project, Worldly Language, Sacred Texts, Buddhist Philology, and the Origins of National Learning in Early Modern Japan. Welcome, Professor Bushelle. And last but not least, Professor McCormick joins us from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, where she teaches Japanese history. Her current book project addresses the Japanese women photographers who owned studios, made fascist propaganda, and turned their cameras against corporations and the state from the 1930s to the 1970s. She is the co-director of an amazing resource in the form of a website, Behind the Camera, Gender, Power and Politics in the History of Japanese Photography. Welcome, Professor McCormick. So today, each of our speakers will be talking about their research in turn, and this will be followed by a brief discussion between them. And finally, we will be taking a few questions from you, the audience. In preparation of this, if you could please make sure that if you have any sort of thoughts or questions that occur to you during their talks or at any point, please put anything you wish to ask in the Q&A chat function, which you can find on the sort of bottom of your screen, clearly marked there as Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention, and Professor Marotti, now over to you. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin with a few words about our special issue and a few words of gratitude. The five contributors to Imagination of the Real represent a range of approaches and areas of historical interest, from the medieval to the post-war. And my two colleagues joining me today will speak respectively to that breadth as they discuss their work. Representing a range of work from former and current UCLA graduates, the essays in the special issue also point to a wider set of historical inquiries from other scholars from our program. And those cohorts were foundational to everyone's work and writings and helped sustain them during and often after their doctoral studies, even while inspiring those of us in a mentoring role. And now they're out to contribute to and inspire the field more broadly as our colleagues. So that's a hat tip to the broader mutuality and collegiality, and something that's been a real pleasure for me to see develop at UCLA during my 16 years on the campus. I'd also, of course, like to thank Chief Editor Hannah Osborne here and the Japan Forum staff, along with former chief editors Bill Mihalopoulos and Chris Gertais, for giving us this forum and opportunity to share or to showcase our shared approach to historical work. So let me have a few words on that to preface our discussion. As I wrote in the introduction, Japan Forum represents a kind of meta field of work connected in and through Japan, and demonstrates the recognition that the importance of our investigations is rather more than the detailing of the singular history of some substantialized entity, Japan, the proper noun reducing all acts and events within its border to its incommensurable and special life story. Our investigations each necessarily manifest a critical project organized by a reflexive relation to the subjects of our investigation. The five essays of the special issue all underscore historical difference and the contentions that structure apparent reality itself. They demonstrate how that reality is marked with exclusions, distinctions, and competing claims of legitimacy and capacity. And they demonstrate how alternative conceptions merit consideration as historical objects. Our work is grounded in an approach to cultural history. Culture in this framework is not about cultures, plural, and especially not nation-dependent organicist ideas of national culture. Rather, it's about the dimension of people's lives involved with meaning-making and perception. So this sense of culture is about thinking about how people perceive and interpret and understand the world in different ways. We pay special attention to contention and creativity because although everybody has a world, we all have different ones, even or especially within nation states. And of course, the same holds for people before the nation state system and its powerful impulses towards conformity. Regardless, people within communities differ in how they see the world and argue constantly about what's happening and about also how they got to their present. They argue about the meaning of the past and the present. They present different and contending visions of connection and community, and they discover potentials and possibilities in the course of those disagreements. It's also the case that despite recent controversies about presentism in our discipline, we face the inescapable fact that we conduct history in the present, a present in which the past exists as one of its dimensions. History, therefore, represents then a structured engagement now with the dimension of the present that is the past, and with both representing diverse conflictual fields. Their articulation in our historical work, therefore, negotiates between transformations now and our relation with that multifarious past. That makes it constantly dynamic as we continue to think about historical difference and commonalities, possibilities, and resonances. Gabrielle Spiegel put it this way in her presidential address to the American Historical Association some years ago: "No longer a given of the past that offers itself to the historian's gaze, the historical referent is something constantly recreated in that recurring movement between past and present, hence ever changing as that relationship itself is modified in the present." And she goes on to relate historical discourse to narrative and the fictive, rehearsing points first put forward by Hayden White about a half century ago, and in order to conclude that, quoting again, "In this process, the historical referent, or what used to be called the real, the true, the fact, is not so much obliterated as displaced." So with this in mind, I'll black the screen here, we might turn again to our special issue and the framing of imagination and the real to invite a broader conversation. Maybe just for a fun view, I'll put up the next slide just so that you don't have to stare at a black screen. It's a conversation that necessarily relates at once to how we understand the disciplinary work of history and reflexively how we understand the subject of our analysis. Again, from the standpoint of cultural history, a history attuned to differences in how humans experience, practice, and understand the world in diverse ways, our issue focuses upon the different ways in which that imaginative relation challenges us to do work that adequately grasps this essential dimension of the human and historical, and to understand it as essential to historical reality itself. For modern and contemporary work, this framing is inescapable and distinctive. For example, as I addressed in my introduction to the special issue, there's, of course, the problem of the preeminent imagined community, the nation, and the modern nation-state system. It is, in Madhu Goswami's words, a deep structure with all kinds of effects shaping our practices and thinking. Relatedly, I might mention a point discussed in my current seminar in Japanese history just this week via a reading by Andrew Sartori. We were considering the problem of real abstraction. That is, the very real way that human practices within capitalist modernity include elements that functionally relate and equate all human labor. Without getting into a Marxian analysis, I just want to note that real abstraction means that actual practices have an abstract component that is absolutely real. one that amounts to a kind of thinking or imagining independent of our attitudes or beliefs. And it's also what facilitates thoughts and demands, such as Kinoshita Naoe's, as quoted by Emily Anderson in her contributed essay, quoting, "Shouldn't all of the current emperors and kings be made into laborers?" It's a radical leveling of sovereigns into a universality of laborers, irrespective of nations and lineages, proclaimed in 1904 in Maebashi to a youth club. But it's certainly not the case that the modern is the only time in which abstract and imaginative mediate social reality. Any community bigger than a handful of settlements is going to have some dimension of imagination as not just a supplement to empirical reality, but the very thing that creates community itself and makes it intelligible. So in order to bring this down to a relatable example, I thought I might turn to the illustration that we've shared in the publicity for this event. And here's a related photo, actually. This draws on my own work, where I've been especially interested in art and politics as related but never identical practices, and thinking in turn about eventfulness within the context of the global 1960s. As an essential, vibrant part of culture, artists maintain a dialogue with the world, reflecting their own perspectives, but more to the point, attending to phenomenon through the medium of art itself. Through art, we create the possibility of seeing things differently, separate from anyone's intention or expectation, and of being moved by that new perception. Or to quote artist Nakajima Yoshio, art is the next possibility. The play of perceptions and forms in art often runs contrary to the wishes of those invested in the way things are. And that's why there's a long history the world over of attacks on art and expression. And while such disturbances are often greeted with hostility, they represent the living part of culture, of people and their imaginations. Again, this is part of the charge of doing cultural history, of being attentive to this aspect of conflict and change within creative work as much as within political activism. So in this image, we have Akasegawa Genpei, an amazing artist, writer, illustrator, photographer, and all-around astonishing person, walking across the street around 1967 with his work colloquially known as the enlarged yen. It's a hand-drawn and painfully detailed copy of the face of the B series 1,000 yen note. And this was part of a larger project in which he made monochrome life-size prints of the same note, first as an invitation to an exhibition, and then for a variety of uses, including wrapping objects, burning notes on television, and the like. And in 1964, he found himself first investigated and then indicted under an 1895 law banning not counterfeiting, but rather mozo, or money resemblance. Without getting into those details, which orient my previous book and situate an investigation into artistic direct action in an untimely critical discourse on everyday life in the 60s, that's my shameless plug, his work explored some confounding aspects of money. For starters, seen from the perspective of art, where's the original? Money is an iterative set of prints, but there's no original to speak of. And yet it is real, a real thing, maybe the preeminent real thing. One where the government, in fact, has a massive investment in ensuring, through monopolized printing and policing alike, that no one else can contest their right and ability to make these real things. And yet they're prints on paper. There's a design, an image borrowing some additional authority. Here, it's Shotoku Taishi in the B series 1,000 yen note, but it's essentially a picture. These were some of the thoughts that led Akasegawa to begin exploring money, and I'm making a long story here short, believe me. But as he and his supporters came to appreciate money's reality related to problems of state legitimacy, not dissimilar to the problem of police and the state's monopoly of legitimate use of force. Money's reality depends upon us suspending doubt in these pieces of paper and treating them as bearers of worth, effectively constituting belief in practice, and really rather unconsciously, as we handle these things as they flit in and out of our lives, usually more out than in, unfortunately. But what would happen if we didn't believe? What if these works could open or model that possibility of unbelief? This is where a discourse of direct action takes off. Now, all of this is to note through this brief example of the ways in which cultural history attentive to such concerns can follow them to grasp conflictual as well as suppressed aspects of social reality. Paying attention to art and politics for me has yielded a rather different perspective on post-war history and the global. And I think you can recognize similar operations in the diverse works in the special issue. And hopefully we can invite a stimulating discussion from everyone who's kindly joined us today. And with that, let me pass the Zoom square off to Professors Bushelle and McCormick. And thank you again for your kind attention. Stop sharing the screen. Yes, good.
Thank you so much, Professor Marotti. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. First, I'd like to reiterate Professor Marotti's thank yous to everyone at Japan Forum and add to that a special thank you to Professor Marotti himself, who not only invited me to contribute to the special issue and to today's event, but has also been a wonderful mentor since I first started at UCLA way back in 2009, which feels like a lifetime ago now. So my essay in the special issue takes its inspiration from a deep-seated frustration of mine regarding the portrayal of Japan in modern scholarship. Benedict Anderson famously proposes as a paradox of nations their, quote, objective modernity to the historian's eye versus their subjective antiquity in the eyes of nationalists, end quote. I've long felt that modern historians of Japan have taken this statement a little too facilely, rallying around a position that Japan was a wholly modern invention that had little to no resonance before the watershed year of 1868. Even those scholars who push the innovation of Japan further back tend not to do so before the early modern period and the discourses on Japaneseness introduced by scholars of Kokugaku in the 18th century. Yet even a cursory glance at the sources will reveal that there is an abundance of texts that describe Japan, even valorize Japan before that point. Indeed, the concept of, again, Japan or Nihon as a land deserving some kind of pride of place predates modernity by a good millennium. Of course, and perhaps needless to say, we would be remiss to run with that knowledge and claim unbroken continuity between the Japans of the past and the Japan of the present. As Professor Marotti writes in his introduction to this special issue, this is a quote, nationalistic assertions of distinctiveness flatten the historical actuality of a field of diverse and competing scenes, compressing them within geographical and teleological frames as a tautological testimony to the primacy of such assumptions, end quote. So just because a notion of Japan, or really multiple such notions, existed in pre-modern times does not mean that it was the same Japanese nation state that we contemplate today. Nevertheless, denying the presence of a pre-modern Japan altogether is not only historically irresponsible, in my opinion, but also lends fuel to the subjective antiquity in the eyes of nationalists that Anderson describes, insofar as it allows to remain critically unexamined those pre-modern iterations of Japan that do appear in the historical record. My essay thus seeks to shed light on some of the ways Japan was imagined in the medieval period, which I understand expansively as spanning the 9th through 16th centuries. The essay is entitled Before Nativism, because I was interested in investigating the idea of Japan and indeed Japan-centrism, not only before the modern period, but also before the early modern period and the nativist discourse of Kokugaku, which is my area of expertise. There's simply too much in Kokugaku that draws on older intertexts, I felt, for the discourse on Japan to be wholly new. What I found is that there are some through lines along which Japan as a country has long been celebrated, and these revolve around 3 cultural markers: the kami, or the native deities, the tenno, the emperor, and waka, Japanese poetry. These three are, of course, interlinked, as both the Tenno and Waka are typically considered as derived from the kami and are privileged according to that relation. Yet, as I emphasize in my essay, the value of these cultural markers shift significantly from the medieval to the early modern periods. In the early modern and even the modern periods, these are privileged because of their proximity to the supposed creation of the cosmos, what I call their cosmogonic import. By contrast, in the medieval period, they are celebrated because they are viewed as aids to Buddhist enlightenment and accordingly valued for their soteriological function. This difference between cosmogony and soteriology also exemplifies the manner in which Japan itself is imagined and valorized. Thus, in early modern nativism and in forms of modern nationalism, Japan is celebrated for its unique origin in the age of the gods, the kami, and all the attendant privileges that is purported to construe. In the Japan centrism of medieval Buddhism, on the other hand, Japan is celebrated for the ability of its denizens to achieve Buddhist salvation or enlightenment, something that is compared favorably to the other main countries of the medieval Japanese Buddhist world, India and China. I want to give some concrete examples from my essay to give you a sense of what I mean, starting with the late 9th century Tendai exegete Annen. Annen writes, let me see if I can share this. Annen writes in his treatise, the Bodai Shingisho, or a commentary on the doctrine of the Bodhi mind, quote, "The heretical paths in the two vehicles of India do not have faith in the Mahayana. The scholars of the way of the great Tong believe Lao Tzu to be emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha. And yet, although they have faith in the Buddha, they do not seek to become Buddhas. India, the great Tong, and other countries as well have wise and foolish people. We Japanese, Waga Nihonjin, even in towns and villages, all know how to be Buddhas. Mina Jobutsu Oshiru." The frame for situating Japan here is not, it is worth emphasizing, a modern world of nations or anything close to it. Rather, it is the medieval Buddhist three countries worldview of India, China, and Japan. Accordingly, it is not any innate cultural or geographical quality that Annen emphasizes in his claims for the superiority of the Japanese people over their Indian and Chinese counterparts. Rather, it is definitively soteriological. Japanese are laudable because they know how to be or become Buddhas. That is, they know how to attain enlightenment. In this early example of Japan centrism, it's noteworthy that those cultural through lines that I mentioned earlier of kami, waka, and tenno are not yet visible. It's not until the late 10th century, when the Buddhist three countries worldview was introduced into discussions of waka poetry, that we really see this emerge. We can find one such example with the Tendai prelate, Jien, who writes in the Shugyokushu, "What is called spoken Japanese, wago, is something that has flourished as a technique of our country, or wagakuni. It has 5 lines of 5-7-5-7-7. These make apparent the 5 elements and 5 phases. There is no thing, whether from an ultimate or conventional perspective, that diverges from it. From the perspective of the ultimate truth, there is nothing that is separate from the 5 elements, all the way from the body of the Buddha down to the insentient grasses and trees." So here, Jien claims that spoken Japanese, as it is vocalized in waka poetry, is a kind of truth language capable of perfectly representing reality. He then goes on to argue that for this reason, waka is no different from the Buddhist way itself, as he writes, "Since it is a speech act of our country, the way of waka is also the way of the Buddha." Let me stop sharing. Okay. Elsewhere, as I detail in my essay, Jien makes clear that it's not simply an equivalency between waka and Buddhism that he has in mind, but rather a hierarchical relationship, wherein waka and Japanese subsume both Sanskrit and Chinese as a kind of ultimate universal language of truth. This trend is continued by other medieval poets and scholars who frame waka as not only no different from Buddhist mantra or dharani, but superior to it precisely because it makes the linguistically incomprehensible mantra readily accessible to the Buddhist practitioner. What was important to both Annin and Jian and others then was the claim that Japan was an ideal Buddhist realm populated by a people and characterized by a language superlatively well-suited to Buddhahood. Indeed, one might argue that it is only according to that soteriological framework that Japan in this context materializes at all, let alone becomes superior to other lands of the Buddhist world. Returning to Professor Murati's points just now about cultural history and the tension between reality, so-called, and imagination, I will end by emphasizing how important belief was to the constitution of the medieval world I'm describing here. This is, of course, belief of the old-fashioned religious variety. So belief in Buddhas, in karma, in salvation. And when that belief ebbed in the early modern period, it opened the way for new modes of imagining Japan, ones that had to find different frames of reference for their validation. Thank you.
Thanks, Emi. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. How does that look, everyone? Okay. I want to echo everyone's thanks to the editors of Japan Forum, to Professor Murati for his stewarding of this article. And then I also see that Vicky Young is in the audience, who read drafts of my piece as well. So thanks to all of the people who made this work possible. I think it's great that Emi started from this position of launching research and an argument from a point of frustration, because I think I could extend that to my own impetus for this work. And that also said, I don't want to speak for Dan Abe in this, or Abby in this issue, but I think that might also apply to the place where he began with his research as well. And so yeah, so just beginning from there, I think in this issue, both Dan, Abby, and I are rethinking what constituted the foundational discourses of the photography world in the decades after the war. Scholars and critics have established and reaffirmed the prominence of conversations around what realism or documentary photography meant in the first 15 years after the war, but have treated this as the only focus of photographic culture of this period and continue to reproduce that logic over and over again. Emphasis then on figures such as Domon Ken or Natori Yonosuke on the one hand, and Tomatsu Shomei, or in the later generation, the Provoke group on the other, who engaged in debates around what realism meant, has only then served to reify this argument that realism was all anyone was talking about, and those with a stake in its debates were the most important figures of Japanese photography. And so there's this sort of like cyclical logic that happens in scholarship on Japanese photography that's just kind of re-repeating this argument over and over again. And part of my frustration with beginning this work was trying to orient research on Japanese photography and photography in general more towards a mass practice of photography. How are more people in their everyday lives experiencing and practicing photography? And in order to understand that, you have to move beyond this constant focus on realism. So in this issue, as Dan, Abby, and I show, once you actually sit down and look through the magazines, newspapers, photo books, endless pamphlets, and amateur productions that both photo professionals and amateurs were engaging with, there are many other photographic practices of equal importance that come into focus. So tracing these conversations across all these different media forms, one finds that photographers who were involved in a wide range of practices, there were many photographers involved in a wide range of practices, and this extends across photojournalism into staged nude photography to collage and advertising photography. And it's this participation in these practices that is always simultaneous and never exclusive. So what I mean by this is that the way the photo world functions is that to make a living as a photographer, one is always engaged in multiple fields of production, while at the same time also upholding the myth that one is only engaged in the making of documentary photography or whatever the perceived sort of like high form of photography happens to be in the moment. So what became important to me to write about was how at the same time that a figure like Domon Ken, which everyone has written about ad nauseum, is writing these calls for the right way to supposedly make realism photographs, he was also serving as the judge on nude shooting session events and himself shooting staged nude photographs, which he sold to make a living as a photographer. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, and I don't want to focus on Domon Ken at all today. So I want to begin to launch this conversation around what it means to do historical research by walking you through the process that I went through with researching this article. So as a historian interested in the social formations of photography, I was struck by this photograph taken in the early post-war period of Ratai Geijutsu, or nude art, that the Japan Professional Photographers Society had selected to represent post-war photo culture in one of the first volumes on the history of Japanese photography published in 1970. A group of men in suits clustered around a mostly naked woman in a public space who does definitely not seem to enjoy the position that she's in. And you can even see this in the top left, this figure in the background who's probably not even involved in the event, just sort of like trying to get an eyeful. I became curious about what this was, this nude shooting session. And I started looking, and once I did, I found the nude shooting session everywhere. It was in the Asahi Shimbun, where the police and reporters were debating on shifting ideas around what constituted obscenity in the 1950s. The nude shooting session was covered in photography magazines, which represented it in caricature and printed etiquette guidelines for how to conduct oneself at such an event. It came up in ads for studios that were advertising nude models that came a la carte, as long as one purchased a spot in the studio. And photographer Tokiwa Toyoko included a spotlight on the nude models and photographers who worked these events in her book, Kiken na Arabana. So at the same time that photography media was very focused on advertising women's bodies as the recreational subject for both amateur and professional photographers, I also found evidence of a focus on photography as the so-called new workplace for women in the post-war period. And so it struck me that media constructions of the woman photographer and all of this sort of representation of speculation and surprise around women as photographers in the 1950s was very connected with representing women as the subjects of photography. So in this article and in my book manuscript, I argue that in a moment when supposedly women were entering into the photography workforce at historic numbers, the visual insistence on women as models, fundamentally as subjects of photography and not photographers, was a very significant form of gatekeeping on the behalf of the photography world. Adding to the insistence that women were not photographers, even camera advertising itself in this period wrote into its copy the idea that optical technologies were beyond their capacity. And so there's a lot of ads, kind of like this Primaflex ad, that even though it's, you would expect this kind of shift with 35mm to be focusing on cameras being supposedly more easily usable for a broader range of users, which is the copy that gets picked up in the 1970s. But even for a twin reflex, there's this copy that's kind of pushing this line about making optical technologies available to women finally. And sorry, I skipped past this last image, but this is part of the wide range of media constructions of the woman photographer in the 1950s. And there's just so many images like this that are really kind of capitalizing on a lot of public interest in many different forms of work and labor that women are engaging in the 1950s, but in particular, photography seems to be a very visible way to address this break or a shift in what women's labor looked like in the post-war period. So Tokiwa Toyoko stood in direct critique of all of these logics, that women were only the subjects of photographs and that women did not know how to use optical technologies. I can very confidently argue that she is the most imaged woman photographer of the 1950s. And so she had a very interesting relationship with both courting the press and making herself available for representation in women's magazines, in photography magazines, in various mass publishing outlets, at the same time that she is really trying to be critical of that position. So she navigated what it meant to be a constant focus of all of these media forms as kind of the woman photographer of the 1950s. And it's precisely because she was under the spotlight for her sexual difference within a male-dominated field that one of her most well-known series, Hataraku Josei, focused on working women, including secretaries, wrestlers, sandwich board wearers, sex workers, pearl divers, and nude models, just to name a few of the women that she photographed in the 50s. And these Hataraku Josei is a really interesting photo series. There's no record, there's no full record of all the images included in it, but it was mostly actually reproduced in women's magazines. And this is a selection of it that was reproduced in her book. On the left, you have the nude models, and on the right, the pearl divers. So one of my hopes in this research is to demonstrate the way that the social construction of the meanings of women photographers was crafted through the circulation of representations of them. And at the same time, the way that a photograph by Tokiwa moved through the mass marketed weeklies and photo magazines really kind of demonstrates how all of these different outlets are picking up on this idea of the supposed sort of scandal of a woman photographer photographing other naked women. The rapid circulation of these images was largely due to publishers' suspicions that publics would be interested in this type of topic. All of the reporting on her work seems to kind of scream, look, a woman photographing naked women. Now, Tokiwa's own work reflected the desire for a transformation in perception away from women as photographed objects and towards women as active, seeing, photographing, decisive agents. In her representations of sex workers in Yokohama, one can see this process played out as she moved from photographing the women catering to the American military as acts of condemnation of their labor. So she says she explicitly went to photograph them as a way to visualize the hate she felt for them. And through her process of going to places like, she goes to this clinic where women are being inoculated for STDs. And in this case, she captures this series of photographs in the doctor's clinic by putting on a doctor's white coat and hiding her camera behind her coat. And so she's really kind of there to, in her words, capture a scene that most people would not be seeing in order to expose these women. And this is a very kind of forceful and almost violent act of exposure. But as she moves through, and this is another instance where she's hiding in a procession of monks who are marching through Isazaki-cho in Yokohama, and she captures this really interesting interplay between an image of the monk chanting as he walks through the streets and a sex worker in the background. As she is making these images, she describes how she has this transformation perception where she moves from hatred and condemnation towards actual empathy and seeking to understand what motivated women to take up this type of labor in this period. Sorry. So by following this interconnected constellation of discourses across print media in the 1950s, I was able to bring a much forgotten event, the nude shooting session, the social construction of and media specularization around the woman photographer, and see how it allows us to contextualize not only one photographer's work, but also the ways in which a lot of the photo world was poised against letting new members into its club. In this case, the differences in visibility have been perpetuated by a lack of archival research and willingness to continue to perpetuate, or a lack of interest in historicizing the construction of these types of myths in the photography world. And with that, I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your wonderful presentations, and so insightful, so many sort of points that we could sort of pick up on there. I sort of just wanted to kick off a bit of a discussion. I don't know whether I'm sort of usurping your role there, Bill, in doing so, but this sort of relationship that runs through all of those discussions between imagination and the real seems sort of really important and pivotal to each paper. And it's something I've also been looking at in my own research and work. Do you feel like there's sometimes a danger or a dangerous discourse which insists on the imagination and the real being different or other, separate from each other in some way? And in what sense does that danger manifest itself in your specific research? And do you see yourself as sort of counteracting that danger through what you do? Sorry if that's a really kind of out there question.
I can start. I mean, I absolutely agree that there is a danger in insisting on the difference between the imagination and the real, because that in fact posits that there is in fact a real out there, right? That there is a real that somehow exists outside of the realm of social, outside of society, outside of social construct, outside of people, right? It's almost like some kind of numinous sphere that you're positing there. And that takes on, it almost takes on, it's something beyond critique in that sense. So yeah, that it kind of obscures the fact that the real is always being continually and dynamically constructed by people's imaginations, by this interaction of people together and this construction of imagination, right? How that applies specifically to my research is sort of an interesting question. Certainly when it comes to medieval Buddhism, I mean, I think it allows the Buddhist imagination to take on a kind of sanctity or sacredness, right? It's almost a religious kind of perspective that now you have a Buddhist world, or that these Buddhist tenets, Buddhist doctrine is something real. And it really has no place in social academic discourse, I would say. So yeah, I think the two have to always be seen kind of together as these mutually complementary things. And the real is in fact something that the imagination concocts.
If I can add on to that, for me, in some ways, that kind of radical empiricism or naive empiricism for me is sort of like a misplaced modeling of scientific seeming discourse. And, the funny thing about that is, I think it was just announced this month that the particle physicists have proven the non-existence of local reality without observation based on how particles work. And so, science says, no, no, that's actually radically wrong. So it's, yeah, sorry for that. But this is really about the understanding historical difference and difference now and then, and as a dynamic relation, and just trying to really step up as historians to not misrepresent either ourselves or the subjects of our work.
Yeah, those are all really great thought-provoking points. I think a lot about this axe I'm grinding about trying to shift people to think more about mass practice and like what are the sources, historical sites for understanding what mass practices of photography look like. And when I say things like, I think that various myths, scholarly myths, are perpetuated by a lack of engagement with the archive. I'm very aware that could be too easily translated into sort of a simplistic view of like that by then, if only we could read everything that exists in the archive, we would somehow know the truth of what's happening. And as a modernist, like it's impossible to ever read everything that's in the archive because there's too much. I am very aware that on my own selection of materials is its own frame of what is possible, humanly possible to take in. But But at the same time, I think that there's a way that you can argue for pushing beyond, in the same way that Emi is arguing for pushing, sorry, excuse me, Dr. Foulk, pushing beyond the same sort of like tried and true arguments that people are making about the way that people's thought about their own existence is functioning in a historical moment. Like, how do you look for new sources to describe what that looked like for people that go beyond what has already kind of been very hashed out?
Can I just add one point there? Because Kelly's work is a really good example of, doing exactly what you just said. You came out of a really careful sifting of mounds and mounds of archival stuff to see, something that was occluded in a kind of retcon of misremembering of what 50s discourse on photography was about, and going right into this, this contradiction in, the cameraman in a skirt. And I love the translation of Shashinka as cameraman. It's as really specific, but to capture this kind of dynamic through careful empirical work, because it's there, it's real. But you miss it if you just sort of blow through it and it's data and you're not thinking about your categories reflexively.
Can I also ask a sort of question specifically to Professor Bushelle on that sort of point? Actually, you mentioned in your article, but also in your presentation briefly, about this sort of emphasis on the Japanese language in some way, sort of being a perfect vehicle for achieving, through which you can achieve enlightenment, and this sort of sense that kotoba in itself is something that is able to materialize, or it's something that I've read in many places, but this sort of whole kind of idea of the tradition of kotoba and Japanese poetry being able to in some way make Buddhist kind of enlightenment realized. Is that, can you talk a little bit more about that, because that's quite a sort of difficult thing to comprehend?
Sure. I think what's really interesting, right, is and like, as I mentioned, I'm really a scholar of Kokugaku in the early modern period. This kind of medieval Buddhist stuff is a little bit outside of my comfort zone. But as perhaps you're aware, Kokugakusha are very interested in the Japanese language, right? And scholars like Motori Norinaga, who have gotten a lot of attention, make very large claims about the ability of the Japanese language specifically to point to some kind of truth. And for him, it's really this Japanese orality, because he is trying to get away from any kind of continental influence. And of course, writing inevitably for Japanese comes from China and has that continental influence. But what was really interesting for me was realizing that this kind of valorization of language that we see in Kokugaku actually has its origins, ironically enough, in this Buddhist discourse that was very interested in signifying truth through language. And that really comes from esoteric Buddhism. So it comes from Shingon Buddhism, and this idea that there is a cosmic Buddha, Mahavairochana, who chants, and that the entire cosmos are these reverberations of his voice. So we see there that language is getting this incredible significance, this incredible import placed upon it, right? And so there is this idea in esoteric Buddhism that, in fact, the truth can be signified through language. It just has to be the proper language, and that language is mantra and dharani, right? And this was language that was chanted in Japan in Sanskrit. And so what we see in the medieval period are these kind of efforts to, well, first later on there's efforts to actually dissect Sanskrit, really understand it grammatically to try to get to this truth. But in the medieval period, there's this equivalence that we see being made between waka and dharani, and saying that waka is the dharani of Japan. Probably Muju Ichien is the most famous one who sort of says that in the Shasekishu. But it gets reiterated over and over and over again. Waka is the dharani of Japan. And as you can see in the quotes that I provided from Jien, that becomes a kind of way in which to, in fact, say that waka is not only the same as dharani, but it's better, right? It's better because we can understand it, basically, because it's in Japanese, it's comprehensible linguistically. It's not just this kind of, from the Japanese perspective, gibberish. It has real significance. These are real words. And yet the idea is that it too points directly to the truth. And so pointing to the truth is the truth of enlightenment, right? And so thus that is why it has this kind of salvific utility or salvific function. The idea is that once you understand the truth, and from a Buddhist sense, this is the truth of dependent origination, that we have no self, we're all dependently arisen, then you attain Buddhahood. So it's very much dependent on this Buddhist framework to give Japanese language that significance. I mean, it's hard to imagine how it would exist outside of that framework. And really, once we get into the early modern period, the Kokugakusha sort of lift that out and do away with the Buddhist framework and act as if this is some kind of natural indigenous quality that has existed all along. I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. I feel like I understand that so much better now. Yeah.
Can I just add something, because I'm constantly adding something, but which is one of the really interesting things in Emi's work is to recognize that statement as about language and knowledge, and it underscores the way in which that gets sort of misappropriated as like a transhistorical claim about a substantive entity, the Japanese language, that then moves through time, that we can have as substituting for a modern imagined Japanese nation. And lots of studies about language will tell you that this is way before national standardization of the language. This is there's all sorts of gaps and things. It's a claim about the words that the person is writing or saying at that time, not about an expansive geographical entity bounded by language. So that's I think Emi's careful work on poetics really brings that out.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, no, that really helps. Shall we are you ready to move to a few questions from our audience? And I can see we've got one question in the Q&A box. So please, if you're in the audience and you have a question to ask, please type that into the Q&A box. And if we have time, we will read that out. Our question is from Ra Mason, who is asking a question. I think, again, this is for Emi. He said, do you think that early pre-Meiji forms of religiously informed Japanese identity compared to, for example, contemporary European or EU identity vis-a-vis individual national identities? Or is the argument that, in fact, there was a powerful national conception of Japan prior to the Meiji Restoration?
Yeah, definitely the argument is not that there was a powerful conception, a national conception of Japan prior to the Meiji Restoration, right? Quite the opposite, that it wasn't national at all, and that it was religiously informed. I guess I'm not entirely sure about contemporary European identity vis-a-vis individual national identities, but I will say that the argument I'm making is that there isn't like a state apparatus or state adjacent apparatuses that are kind of indoctrinating people about what Japan means, right? This is a different framework altogether. And so we may have like Buddhist proselytizing kind of itinerant preachers who travel around and are preaching sermons, telling stories about salvation. Definitely, I mean, if you look at something like the Nihon Ryoiki or the Konjaku Monogatari, there's tales about the three countries of China, India, and Japan, all within this religious Buddhist framework, right? And this is the way that Japan comes into relief, the way that Japan makes sense. And it's only in that context that we have this kind of Japan, but it's not national, right? It's very much a kind of religiously grounded identity, if you will. And I do want to emphasize that it certainly doesn't have the kind of reach that national identity has. So we're talking about an elite discourse here that does start to trickle down. I mean, with kind of itinerant preachers who are preaching orally. I mean, we're talking not just a very small contingent of elites, but nevertheless, we're not talking about some kind of geographically bounded country where all of the citizenry agrees that they are Japanese. That is not something that we can see in the sources at all.
Could I also point the questioner to Dr. Emily Anderson's piece within the volume where she's detailing the simultaneous interest of both Meiji socialists and Christian proselytizers and the government, both in formulations of national Shinto, but also policing in, what they're all trying to press into service, either as what's to be a heartland for the nation, or to be the bounds or the grounds of a new socialist imagining of a transnational internationalism. These are very granular contentions, and they're outsized, like little preachers with massive government interest in them, and traveling up the mountain with them and watching from a remote view and so forth. These are real contentions that you can get from that work. And also thanks to Emily for really helping some of the initial stages of editing in this volume. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we have a question from Sherzod Buminov as well, our director of CJS.
If no one else would like to go, I would like to take advantage of being able to ask the question with my own voice. Thank you. Great, fascinating roundtable discussion. I'm a modernist, and I don't know much about some of the topics that you've mentioned, but I'm really interested in the implications and what we can learn about Japan from them. And I have a question for Professor Bushelle. And you mentioned some of the quotes that you presented, really, really fascinating. For example, we Japanese in the towns and villages all know how to be Buddhas. That thing in itself is, well, it will come in handy in my teaching, most definitely, although I don't teach religions. But that also, the feeling I have is, and I don't know exactly which century that is coming from, but
Ninth.
Okay, 9th. Okay, so that must have been useful to the later Neo-Confucian scholars, or just pre-Meiji, or even Meiji's period scholars who were looking at, my knowledge again of this is very limited because I deal with 20th century mostly. But for example, someone like Aizawa Seishisai, or I don't know, anyone even before him, several of the scholars that were, in the Shogun's court, I think the names don't come like
the Mito school you're thinking of?
Yeah, the Mito school, yes. Do you have any evidence that this kind of, these very rich, very kind of persuasive, very inspiring quotes, they were used in any way in legitimizing Japan's superior status to China from where all of that came, either in, as you say, you did mention that they also, the Kokugakuin people didn't only rely on the Buddhist teachings, but whatever teachings they were, be it Confucianism, because Aizawa at some point argued that Japan was more Confucian than China, or Buddhism. Sorry, long-winded question.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know that there's any evidence that Neo-Confucians in the early modern period, like Aizawa Seishisai, drew on someone like Annen. I mean, Aizawa, of course, he's writing in the 19th century. He has a very different framework that he's operating within, right? And he very much has an eye toward the West. Kind of, he's afraid of the incursions that Western barbarians are threatening to Japan. So, I mean, I would say that his orientation is quite different, that I would not put it in this kind of soteriological worldview that I was describing in my paper and in my talk. It's not modern quite, but it's more modern, right? It's sort of closer to this world of nations that we're familiar with today, even though, of course, he is a Neo-Confucian. So yeah, I think that there is a pretty sharp divide that we see between the medieval and the early modern. And I do think that has to do, sort of, as I suggested at the end of my talk, with the kind of ebbing of Buddhist belief, right? These Buddhist frameworks cease to be as powerful and as dominant as they had been in previous eras. And this, of course, has to do with competing frameworks that people from Neo-Confucianism, Confucianism, Dutch learning, Kokugaku are all introducing. So yeah, I don't see that much of kind of continuity between someone like Aizawa, between Annen and someone like Aizawa.
Thank you, Emi. If we've got time, we've just got one more question from Mina Ghosh, who's asking a question to Kelly. She says, regarding Tokiwa Toyoko's photo series on working women, we heard that she interpreted her interaction with the sex workers as a story of going from contempt to empathy. But did she mention anything about the experience of dressing up as a doctor or nurse, and any changes in how she perceived nurses after photographing them with sex workers? Apologies for the very specific question.
Thanks, Nina, for that question. So one of the chapters in Tokiwa's book, Hiken na Adabana, is titled Cameraman in a Skirt. And she sees herself as fundamentally a cameraman or a photographer, because being a photographer is always gendered male in this moment, who then has to put on a series of guises in order to get the scene, and so, or capture the scene that she wants to get. So sometimes she's the cameraman wearing a skirt. She says specifically when she's with sex workers, she dresses in like a cardigan and a skirt so that she'll blend in with them and not stand out, because what she would prefer to do is wear pants in order to be able to move and capture the shots that she wants to get. But so she's a cameraman in a skirt when she's working with the sex workers. When she's trying to, actually totally hide herself, that's when she's the cameraman wearing the doctor's jacket. And then she also describes herself as a hunter. Sometimes she hides literally behind, she's in an okonomiyaki shop or in other shops along the red light district streets to photograph women like a hunter in a blind, where her prey, the sex workers, cannot see her. And so I think this language around, some people have characterized this as a masculinist language around hunting, but it's actually more than just masculinist, this language around, in order to get a shot, you have to see yourself as really almost like a warlike combatant that's willing to put yourself on the line in order to be in this scene, which is a really sort of like very predominant heroic image of what documentary photographers are trying to do in mid-20th century. So she doesn't really talk about putting on any of these guises as then helping her to understand the people around her, in the sense of like, she's not connecting with the nurses or the doctors that she's trying to blend in with. They're more about guises that she puts on in order to be able to capture these images of people unaware. And so I think it's really important to also think about the ethics around, and some critics actually call her out for this, the ethics around photographing people who don't know that you are doing so. And many people actually criticize her for making these images of sex workers and including them in Hataraku Josei, totally uncensored, so you can see their faces and identify who these sex workers were. And I actually think it's, I think about this a lot in my own work, where representing images, especially with the doctor's clinic scene where there's absolutely no chance for any of these people to have given consent for their images, I actually think more and more I would prefer not to reproduce those images, because if that person is still alive, or if their descendants are still alive, like this is actually like a highly compromised position that we're again over and over representing them in. And I kind of can't stand behind reproducing material that was taken in that type of context. And so, but what she really is open about is thinking about how she wants to kind of like move away from trying to, like a hunter, as she describes herself, seize her prey, but instead move towards modes where, eventually she spends so much time with sex workers that she becomes not a friend, but a known person with them, and has conversations with them, and is sharing ramune with them, and like exchanging candies, and really kind of like understanding why they might be in that position. And so I think that's what is the important piece there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much for that lovely answer to Professor McCormick. I was really interested in reading your article as well about, the way you sort of dissect what she does and the difficulties with her sort of falling into her own sort of trap about, her positionality as a woman and photographing, and the fact that she sort of starts to insist on the fact that she can see things that men can't, but she can't see things that men can as a camera woman. And so it certainly seems like a very sort of complex subject to sort of be talking about and discussing. But I suppose we have reached, we're about 8 minutes past 7 now. And I know it's quite late where some of you are, so I will wrap up this session. Thank you all for being such wonderful guests and for being wonderful presenters and speakers today. We were really privileged to have you join us. And thank you also for your wonderful submissions to Japan Forum. If anyone's curious and wants to read more or reread them, they're in the issue 34.4 in Japan Forum, and you can read those at your leisure. But again, thanks to all so much, and I hope you have good mornings or evenings wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you.
And Kelly and Emi, thank you so much. And Sherzad.